cannot catch a break at this point. Now, we know the All-Star votes has been placed. A lot of people have been arguing about the players voting Caitlin Clark, the 11th.
Stop what you're doing and listen, because this week just became the most chaotic 7-day stretch in Caitlin Clark's professional career. And for a player who has already been body-checked, booed while breaking records, and turned into a political football by people who have never watched a single minute of women's basketball, that is saying something. The All-Star votes have been tallied. The numbers are public. And what those numbers reveal is not just a controversy about one player's ranking. It is a collision between two of the loudest and most credible voices in women's basketball, a Hall of Famer and an ESPN analyst, who studied the exact same data and arrived at conclusions so different they might as well have been looking at two separate sports. By the time you finish reading this, you will understand exactly why this story is about far more than whether Caitlin Clark belongs in the top 4. It is about whether the league's own internal machinery can survive the gravitational pull of its most famous player without cracking apart for everyone to see.
Clark and the Indiana Fever is set to play another game tonight that is against the Phoenix Mercury. Last time we seen the Phoenix Mercury, Caitlin Clark was getting choked out on a damn basketball court, and they lost that game. Now, this game here,
Caitlin Clark, who is widely viewed by many as the best player or one of the best players in the sport, finished 11th in player voting among guards for the 2026 WNBA All-Star Game. Not 11th overall across all positions, 11th specifically among guards. Let that settle in for a moment. The woman who has single-handedly reshaped the league's television ratings, sponsorship landscape, and cultural footprint was told by the players she shares a court with every single night that at least 10 other guards deserve recognition before she does. And this was not even the most damaging thing that happened to her in the past week. All-Star starters are selected via a weighted vote among fans 50%, players 25%, and media 25%, with 4 guards and 6 frontcourt players chosen as overall starters. The fans voted Clark as the second best guard in the league behind Paige Bueckers, a fair assessment. The media voted Clark as the third best guard, again, pretty fair. Her fellow WNBA players amazingly ranked her 11th, which is somehow worse than last year when they put her 9th. That descending trajectory from 9th to 11th in player estimation, even as her statistical profile has improved across the board, is the detail that gives this story its edge. If Clark were regressing on the court, the number could be explained by performance alone. But the opposite is true. In 17 games, Clark has averaged 21.2 points, 8.2 assists, 4 rebounds, 0.8 steals and 0.6 blocks while shooting 43% from the field and 34.4% on 7.5 three-point attempts per game. She's done so for a 12-8 Fever team with the best record in the Eastern Conference. Those numbers do not belong to the 11th best guard in any professional basketball league on the planet. They belong to one of the most productive offensive players in the sport right now, a point guard who is simultaneously among the league leaders in scoring and assists while shooting the ball at a career-best clip. If you stripped the name off the stat line and showed it to any scout in any professional league anywhere in the world, they would tell you this is a franchise-caliber player operating at or near her peak. And yet, the women who compete against her every night looked at those same numbers and collectively shrugged.
Now, they did list the injury report for tonight's game, and as you guys can see here, Caitlin Clark will be out for rest. Sophie Cunningham is questionable with back spasms, and we got Aliyah Boston is probable with a lower.
Before anyone leaps to the easiest explanation, the one about jealousy and resentment, it is worth understanding exactly how this number was produced, because the mechanics matter more than most people realize. When WNBA players filled out their ballots, they were asked to put their top 4 players for both guards and frontcourt players. So it's not that Clark was ranked 11th among her WNBA peers, but that she had the 11th highest ranking. Nobody sat down with a numbered list and deliberately placed Clark in the 11th slot. They simply selected 4 guards they believed most deserved to start, and an insufficient number of them wrote Clark's name down. According to an ESPN report, only 85 of the WNBA's roughly 180 players submitted their ballots to pick the All-Star starters. That means more than half of the league's active roster simply did not participate in the process at all. Some of that was apathy, some of it was logistical failure. The Athletic reported that the Los Angeles Sparks failed to distribute all-star voting ballots to its players, which may explain Plum's low finish and could have affected the Fever Stars' placement as well. An entire franchise failing to get ballots into its players' hands is not a minor procedural hiccup. It is a systemic breakdown that distorts every single ranking produced by that vote, and the effects were not limited to Clark. Beyond Clark's strange rank in the player vote, Parker also called out Los Angeles' Kelsey Plum finishing 12th. But Boston and fellow Fever star Kelsey Mitchell, both all-star starters this year, also finished far below the other starters in the player vote. The pattern was impossible to miss. When three players from the same roster all land suspiciously low in the same column, the simplest explanation is not that the entire league decided to wage a coordinated campaign against Indianapolis. The simplest explanation is that the voting process itself is structurally incapable of producing a credible result when turnout is below 50%, and at least one organization never even bothered to hand out the paperwork. That distinction matters because it is the hinge on which the entire debate between this week's two loudest voices turns.
Playing the training staff, bro. We have to at this point. There's nothing in my mind that has me more convinced that the Indiana Fever literally has the worst training.
The first shot fired in this week's war of words did not come from a random podcast microphone fishing for clicks. It came from a three-time WNBA champion and newly minted Hall of Famer who has more credibility inside the sport than almost anyone alive. In a July 8 episode of her Post Moves podcast with Indiana Fever star Aliyah Boston, Candace Parker sent a strong message regarding Clark being the 11th highest-ranked guard in WNBA player votes for the 2026 All-Star Game. Parker did not tiptoe around the issue. She did not couch her criticism in diplomatic language or hide behind qualifiers. She went directly at the players who filled out those ballots and questioned their motives in language that left zero room for misinterpretation. "I think people need to look at themselves in the mirror and realize, man, you got some insecurities," Parker said. "If you're sitting down and putting Caitlin Clark as the 11th best guard, y'all need to go to a therapist and figure out what childhood issues you have. 'Cause if you're sitting there and looking at yourself in the mirror and putting her as the 11th best guard, this is crazy." That is not an analyst offering a measured take for television. That is a legend who spent 16 years in this league, who knows exactly what locker room politics feel like from the inside, telling her peers point blank that this specific pattern has stopped being about basketball evaluation and started being about something personal. And Parker did not stop at Clark. She applied the same standard across the board with a fairness that most people screaming about this story online have failed to replicate. She also called out Kelsey Plum's low ranking, saying Plum finished 12th in player rank, but she'd be percolating all over your defense. Plum is currently sidelined with an injury, which Parker acknowledged as a reasonable factor that players might have considered, the exact kind of contextual grace that nobody appeared to extend to a healthy, performing Caitlin Clark. Parker also reached back into her own career to make the point sharper. "When I sat down, as much as I did not like Diana Taurasi, there ain't no way I'm not going to write her as an all-star," Parker said. "As much as I did not like anyone on the Lynx because they used to whoop our A, I'm not going to not put Maya Moore or Sylvia Fowles." That comparison carries enormous weight because it comes from someone who actually lived through the rivalries she is referencing. Parker is not speculating about what it feels like to vote for a player you despise. She is telling you she has done it because the talent demanded it, and she is mystified that today's players cannot clear the same bar. Candace Parker is one of the most respected minds in all of basketball, both in the men's and women's games, which is how she's been able to transition straight into a media broadcaster role after retiring from the WNBA in 2024. One reason why Parker excels in this new role is that she's not afraid of speaking her mind, even if doing so might ruffle some feathers, particularly among some of her former peers. When someone with that biography says the quiet part out loud, it does not land like an outsider dunking on the league for engagement. It lands like an institutional rebuke from inside the house.
Important part of this. They didn't say that she was the 11th best guard in the WNBA. That's not what happened. As you mentioned, a lot of people didn't get ballots, a lot of people didn't vote, but what they did, they voted for the top 4 guards in the league. That was what the All-Star ballot was. So people were voting for top 4. I don't think that you can make a compelling argument that Caitlin Clark is a top 4 guard in the WNBA. Like, nobody can at this point. That is why she was 11. She got the 11th most votes.
Less than 24 hours after Parker's podcast dropped, the debate migrated to ESPN's First Take, where senior writer David Dennis Jr. offered a fundamentally different read on the exact same data. I don't think you can make a compelling argument that Caitlin Clark is a top 4 guard in the WNBA, Dennis Jr. said on First Take. Nobody can at this point, that is why she was 11th. She got the 11th most votes for being in the top 4. So there's really no controversy about that, especially when you add in the fact that she is one of the most popular players in the WNBA. She's going to make the All-Star Game. Dennis's argument rests on a structural observation about the ballot format. Players were not asked to rank every guard in the league from best to worst. They were asked to identify their top 4. If enough of them genuinely believed 4 other guards deserved the nod more than Clark, then her 11th place finish is a natural mathematical outcome of a 4-slot ballot with limited participation, not proof of a vendetta. What bothers me is when this is framed as some sort of petty jealousy or insecurity by these women in the WNBA, because that's not what I'm seeing is happening with Caitlin Clark, Dennis Jr. continued, citing Parker's recent criticism of WNBA players. Dennis then reached for a series of historical comparisons to support his broader thesis that every transcendently hyped young player gets this treatment, regardless of gender or era. Dennis compared Clark's situation to what Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and Victor Wembanyama faced when they entered the NBA, saying they all dealt with similar treatment early in their careers. He referenced the often-told story of Jordan getting frozen out by veterans at the 1985 All-Star Game, a tale that has been repeated so many times over 4 decades, it has essentially become basketball folklore, though how literally it played out is still genuinely debated by people who were actually in the building that night. He invoked LeBron James entering the league, as the chosen one at 18, and absorbing an extraordinary level of physicality from day one. He even circled back to Parker herself, noting that she was caught in an on-court brawl during her own rookie season, a detail worth sitting with given that Parker is now the person calling out the culture she once navigated. And Dennis did not limit his examples to the distant past. He pointed to Angel Reese, who entered the WNBA alongside Clark and has absorbed her own share of excessive contact, including a physical altercation with the same Alyssa Thomas whose name dominates this week's headlines. Reese finished 7th among frontcourt players in this year's vote and missed the starting lineup herself, despite the attention and marketability she brings to the league. That detail alone should complicate any theory that this is solely the league closing ranks against one specific player, because it clearly is not just happening to Clark. On the surface, much of Dennis's structural argument holds water. The ballot format genuinely does create part of this number. The low participation rate genuinely does distort the results. And the historical pattern of hyped young players facing pushback is absolutely real. But the part that lit the fuse, the claim that no compelling argument exists for Clark as a top 4 guard, collides violently with reality. Clark is averaging a career-best 21.2 points per game, while also shooting at a career-high 43% from the floor and cutting her turnovers down to a career low. Overall, she is the 3rd leading scorer in the league. She is simultaneously the 2nd best distributor in the entire WNBA and the leader of the team with the best record in the Eastern Conference. The idea that no argument exists for including her among the top 4 guards in the sport is, on its face, a staggering claim that requires you to either ignore the stat sheet or weight defensive metrics so heavily that offense becomes essentially irrelevant to the conversation.
What bothers me is when this is framed as some sort of like petty jealousy or insecurity by these women in the WNBA, because that's not what I'm seeing with.
All of this debate might feel like standard mid-season sports media noise if it were not unfolding against the backdrop of what happened 2 weeks ago in Indianapolis. Phoenix Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas received a flagrant foul 2 penalty and a 1-game suspension for recklessly making contact with her fist to the throat area of Clark. The incident happened with 6:52 remaining in the second quarter of the Mercury's 111-109 win over the Fever. After Clark drove to the lane, she tumbled onto her side after making contact with defender Lexi Held. Thomas and Dewana Bonner collapsed onto Clark as they scrambled for the ball. As they tried to recover it, Thomas appeared to thrust her fist into Clark's neck. She then got up and stepped over Clark. No foul was called on the play. The officials working that game did not call a single thing in real time. Indiana's head coach did not wait long to make her feelings known. "We spent all offseason looking at officiating, and I still say the one thing that we keep asking for is consistency," White said after the game. "Clark is not called the same way as everybody else is called. The fist in the throat is crazy, it's dangerous." This was the first time in Thomas' 13-year career that she would serve a suspension. The league office reviewed the play the next day and determined that Thomas had committed what they formally classified as a non-basketball act. The WNBA's review deemed Thomas to have committed a non-basketball act by recklessly making contact with Clark's throat. What followed was uglier than the play itself. Thomas took aim at WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert after receiving her suspension, saying she learned of it moments before it became public, and accusing Engelbert of abandoning players while remaining silent amid the backlash. Thomas disclosed that she had received death threats and racial slurs in the days following the incident, which is its own deeply serious problem that transcends every argument about basketball, no matter which side of this rivalry you occupy. No human being should be subjected to that kind of abuse over a play in a sporting event, full stop. But acknowledging the ugliness of the public response does not erase the severity of the play itself. And it is against this exact backdrop, a fist to the throat, a one-game suspension, an ongoing argument about whether the league's officiating can adequately protect its most visible player, that Dennis reached for a story about Michael Jordan not getting the ball in an Olympic scrimmage 40 years ago as a point of comparison. That juxtaposition, setting a decades-old anecdote about hurt feelings at a practice next to an act the league's own disciplinary office formally classified as reckless, is where the comparison stretches past its breaking point.
Had the freeze out in the Olympics, they would not pass him the ball. LeBron James, when he got in the league and he was the chosen one, they were physical with LeBron James. When we're talking about Wemby right now, we're talking about a guy, the best way to attack him is with physicality and to beat him up. Candace Parker was in the middle of a riot in the middle of a WNBA game in her rookie year because they were attacking her because she was coming in as a prospective GOAT in the league. This happens. Angel Reese, by the way, is somebody who came in with Caitlin Clark, who has experienced flagrant twos, who Alyssa Thomas also basically chokeslammed and threw on the ground.
Here is where intellectual honesty demands a turn that most people engaged in this argument have refused to make. After the clip that generated the outrage, after the line about Clark not being a top 4 guard that sent social media into a spiral, Dennis said something that almost nobody bothered to listen to. Caitlin Clark, to her credit, is not somebody who's going out there and begging for something to be done, Dennis Jr. continued. Caitlin Clark just wants to play basketball. She doesn't want congressional hearings about her being fouled. She doesn't want you to call in the National Guard when there is a foul on her. She wants to play basketball. She wants to deal with the physicality. She just wants it called correctly. This is not some issue where she is a victim of anything. If anything, she is a victim of people using her in bad faith. Read that full passage, and Dennis is not defending anyone who has been physical with Clark. He is making nearly the same argument Clark herself made just last week, when she publicly stated that the non-stop replaying of the Thomas incident and the culture war framing being wrapped around it was doing her own league a disservice. Two people arriving at the same conclusion, stop weaponizing me for your agenda, somehow ended up on opposite sides of the internet's rage meter, because one of them buried that agreement under layers of comparison and qualification that most viewers never stuck around long enough to hear. That does not mean Dennis's overall argument is bulletproof. It means the conversation around it has been almost comically reductive, stripped of every nuance by a media ecosystem that rewards the hottest 11-second clip and punishes anything that requires context to understand.
So you're okaying this behavior, basically. Basically, he's okaying this behavior. My God, he need to be fired, bro.
Dennis faced no shortage of criticism on social media for his take. One fan called the segment disgusting as usual and said the panel should not be taken seriously. Another stated that if you do not think Clark is a top 4 guard, cool, you're just wrong. If you think there isn't even an argument that she's top 4, then that's just flat out stupid. A third accused ESPN of chasing engagement, writing that these companies are thirsty for engagement and they know what gains the most traction in the women's space, no matter how ridiculous it sounds. Dennis has been down this road before, And this was not even the only complaint aimed at ESPN's WNBA coverage this week, with other on-air voices separately criticized for downplaying the Thomas incident and for describing Clark's popularity in terms of where she comes from and what she looks like rather than how she actually plays. Whether you think that criticism of the network is fair or completely overblown probably depends on which commentators you already trust, but the volume of it, 3 or 4 separate flashpoints inside a single week, is difficult to wave off as one bad afternoon of television. That is a pattern building around this network's coverage, and it is bigger than one segment or one analyst.
Did Jordan get frozen out 84-92? Watched it. Anyone saying you can't make an argument for CC being a top 4 guard in the league is silly. Exactly.
So I want to
Dude
make
is retarded as.
As this story was unfolding across podcasts, television desks, and social media timelines, the Indiana Fever were preparing to face the Phoenix Mercury again, this time in Phoenix, the first meeting between the two teams since the Thomas incident. And Clark would not be on the court. Clark is currently nursing a back injury and has been sidelined for the past couple of games. The same back issue that has intermittently plagued her this season, the same one that had her getting worked on courtside in the spring, flared up again. She has been listed as out for rest. Several of her Fever teammates were also dealing with ailments. Aliyah Boston continues to manage a lower leg problem that dates back to the offseason, one she picked up playing in unrivaled over the winter. Months later, she is still working around it during the regular season. Whether or not you buy the theory that Indiana's training staff bears responsibility for the persistent nature of these injuries, the fact remains that when a core piece of your roster cannot fully shake something for that long, people start asking uncomfortable questions about the people whose job it is to get her right. With Clark sidelined, Stephanie White faces the challenge of solving her rotation without the one player opposing defenses are specifically built to contain. How Boston and Kelsey Mitchell handle the extra workload will reveal a great deal about whether Indiana can hold its position in a crowded Eastern Conference without leaning on Clark for every single minute of every single game, especially with tougher opponents queuing up right after this back-to-back. Strip away the noise, the hot takes, the social media fury, and the culture war framing that has been draped over this story like a wet blanket, and what remains is a surprisingly clear
disrespect this young lady received on a daily basis. We're talking daily basis. When it comes to the internet, when it comes to the perception of Caitlin Clark, there is nobody other than her fan base primarily that respects her on a level in which she should.
Picture. Candace Parker and David Dennis Jr. looked at the same number and walked away with different explanations. Parker, armed with 16 years of locker room experience, 3 championship rings, and a freshly minted Hall of Fame plaque, says this is insecurity, plain and simple. Dennis, armed with a structural reading of the ballot format and a library of historical comparisons, says this is what happens to every hyped young player in every sport, and the framing of it as jealousy is itself part of the problem. Here is the uncomfortable truth neither of them fully articulated. Both things can be true at the same time. The ballot format genuinely did produce a misleading number. Low turnout and at least one team's complete failure to distribute ballots genuinely did distort the results. And the pattern of hyped young players facing pushback from established veterans is genuinely as old as professional sports itself. But none of that explains why the gap between the player vote and the fan and media votes is specifically this wide for specifically this player in a year when her numbers are specifically this good. Structural problems can coexist with personal resentment. A broken system does not preclude the people operating within it from also harboring bias. And the fact that Clark's own teammates also landed low in the player column suggests that whatever is producing these numbers may not be entirely about Clark herself. But the concentration of the effect around Indiana's roster is hard to dismiss as pure coincidence. Clark makes her 3rd consecutive appearance as a WNBA All-Star.
When this play happened, she got up and ran back to the other side of the court because Caitlin Clark just wants to play basketball. She doesn't want congressional hearings about her being fouled. She doesn't want you to call in the National Guard when there is a foul on her. She wants to play basketball. She wants to deal with the physicality. She just wants it called.
Our starter, but her peers tried their best to prevent it. In the end, the player voting did not account for much as Clark rightfully ended up as an all-star starter, and will now have the opportunity to prove her peers wrong at the July 25 All-Star Game held in Chicago. The timing amplifies everything. Clark is not at full health. The Fever are fighting to maintain their position. And the All-Star Game in Chicago on July 25th is now going to carry a completely different storyline than a mid-season exhibition normally does. Head coaches still have to fill out the 12 reserve spots behind the 10 starters, which means this exact argument about how much the player vote should be trusted is about to play out again in a few weeks, just with a different committee making the decisions. The Thomas incident, the voting controversy, the ESPN debate, the training staff questions, the congressional letters, the death threats, the racial slurs. All of it has converged into a single week that feels less like sports news and more like a stress test of whether the WNBA's infrastructure can handle the weight of its biggest star without buckling under the pressure. As more strange tensions between Clark and the Fever and the rest of the league continue to come to the fore this season, Parker is the most prominent analyst to call out the clear issue with this year's All-Star voting. And that is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. The most forceful defense of Clark this week came not from a fan account, not from a cable news pundit with an agenda, but from a woman who played this game at the highest level for nearly 2 decades, and who understands exactly what it costs to vote honestly when you do not like the person whose name you're writing down. Parker did it anyway during her playing days. She's simply asking why today's players cannot. Whatever happened on the court tonight in Phoenix, this week already answered the only question that truly mattered, and it was never really about whether Caitlin Clark is a top 4 guard. That argument resolves itself the moment you open a stat sheet. The real question is whether the WNBA's own internal processes, its voting mechanisms, its officiating standards, its player protection protocols, its communication with its own athletes, can survive contact with its biggest star without looking fundamentally broken in the process. Right now, the answer to that question is not encouraging. A voting system that produces results this disconnected from on-court reality. An officiating structure that misses a fist to the throat in real time and requires a next-day review to catch up. A commissioner's office that, according to at least one suspended player, cannot even pick up the phone before a punishment goes public. These are not Caitlin Clark problems. These are institutional problems that Caitlin Clark's presence is simply making impossible to ignore. Parker sees it. Dennis, beneath all the historical comparisons and structural explanations, probably sees it too. The question is whether anyone inside the league office is watching closely enough to actually do something about it before the next 7-day stretch makes this one look like the calm before the storm. So here is what this all comes down to. 2 respected voices in women's basketball studied the identical set of numbers this week and gave you opposite answers. Candace Parker, speaking from inside the culture she helped build, called it insecurity and told her peers to seek professional help. David Dennis Jr., speaking from an analyst's chair, called it a structural quirk and a predictable consequence of fame. Both made points that hold up under scrutiny. Both also left gaps in their arguments wide enough to drive a truck through. The truth, as usual, lives in the uncomfortable middle, where a broken ballot and genuine resentment are not mutually exclusive explanations, and where the loudest voices in the room are almost never the ones closest to the actual answer. Clark, for her part, has said what she wants clearly enough: call the game right and stop using me as a weapon. If the WNBA is listening, that is the only mandate that matters heading into Chicago on July 25th. Everything else is noise, and there has been more than enough of that to last the rest of this season.